Welcome to the Singer's Guide to Sheet Music. Today we're going to learn all about the note names, not in terms of how long the notes are, which is what we've been covering in previous lessons, but now in terms of which note we're actually singing on. Are we singing a high note? Are we singing a low note? And how to recognise a general feel for whether we should be moving upwards or downwards between notes. We're also going to talk a little bit about stave that we mentioned last lesson, and understanding the difference between the treble clef and the bass clef. Lots to learn, lots to get started with, so let's do it. So in the last lesson we introduced the stave. So the stave, as you can see, is made up of 5 lines. So there are 5 lines all the way across, and those combined make one stave. So when you're following a piece of music as a singer, you're looking for the stave that has the vocal line written in it. And because you've been doing your homework, hopefully, you'll be very familiar with the idea that the notes are moving around in the stave. So they don't necessarily stay all on the same line. And that's because these lines and the spaces between the lines are what tells us the specific note that we are going to be singing. Now, as a singer, for the large part, it becomes less important for you to know exactly which note you are singing, because a lot of the time we learn music and we learn songs in a kind of a call and response manner. So we tend to listen to a song and we learn the song that way, rather than looking at the music and then figuring out the song. That happens rarely. It does happen, however, in certain choral situations. So there are, in a more traditional choir, so particular kind of church choirs, choral societies, those kind of things, you are expected to do a little bit of sight singing. And sight singing is exactly that. It's looking at the notes and knowing straight away where you need to be jumping to, whether you need to be jumping really high or whether it's a small step, and specifically being able to place it exactly in the right place. If you attend a more contemporary choir, you might find that the sheet music is there more as a guide, and you are taught the parts by your choir leader. That's certainly how I run my choirs. So the sheet music is there and it's available for people, and it's very helpful to help them cement the melodies into their heads if they can see the notes and understand the general gist of what those mean. But I will still sing them the line, and I will still give them guide tracks to practice with at home. So you are learning most of the time through hearing and then repeating, rather than being left completely on your own to look at a piece of music and know exactly what to sing. Being able to do that is a skill that takes quite a long time to perfect. And we are not going to go into huge amounts of detail in this course in how to sight sing. Instead, what I want to do is give you that oversight that makes the music become really useful to you, without you having to absolutely know exactly what note you're on the whole time. Now, the first thing we need to understand when we look at the stave and we look at the music is we need to know whether we're looking at something in the treble clef or the bass clef. Let's talk about that. So, if you see this symbol at the beginning of the stave, this is a treble clef. You may be familiar with this. It's quite a well-used musical symbol. Whenever you see kind of music represented just kind of generally, you will see a treble clef included in there because it's synonymous with music. So when the treble clef is in front of what's being played and what's being sung, it influences what each of these lines and each of these spaces mean. Now, a lot of instruments are played purely on a treble clef. So if you ever learnt recorder in school, the music for that would always be written on the treble clef. because the recorder only uses that range of notes. When you play something like a piano that has a huge range of notes, there's not enough spaces and lines in here to really give you the full overview of what a piano can do. And so for a piano, you need both the treble clef and the bass clef. So the bass clef looks like this. And when you see this mark in front of your music, that's telling you that everything is written on the bass clef. And again, that immediately tells you that the lines and the spaces are on different notes versus the treble clef. And we're going to go into that in a minute and explain what's on what, so that you can start to search that out. There are some instruments that will only be played on the bass clef. So the trombone, for example, or the bass guitar, all of their notes will be played on the bass clef because they are generally pitched low. The instrument is a low pitched instrument, so all of the notes will likely be written on the bass clef. When it comes to singing, 90% of the time, your music that you will be singing will be written on the treble clef, not the bass clef. But if you do sing in a choir situation, and you're in a choir that is lucky to have a large number of men in there, you may find that your music is split into soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And if a piece of music is split into those parts, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, the bass in particular, and sometimes the tenor part, will be written on the bass clef. So it's really, if you're a bass or tenor singer that sings in a choir, you are the people that really need to pay attention to what the bass means. Everybody else can just focus on the treble clef. All female music for singing will be on the treble clef. And a large proportion of tenor music, which generally includes lead vocal songs, so if you pick up a pop song that is sung by a man, it will be written on the treble clef with a proviso. So when men's music is written on the treble clef, it's actually written a whole octave above where you're going to be singing it. And I'll explain that comment in a minute shortly. So because our treble clef is, shall we say, the most popular clef to be using when we're singing, we're going to start with this one. Now, when you see the treble clef in front of it, that tells you straight away what these lines are in terms of what note names there are. So in music, we talk about octaves. Octaves, the oct, like in the word octagon or octopus, oct relates to the number 8. So in music, we talk about our notes being divided into groups of 8. If you've ever seen The Sound of Music, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, may be familiar to you. This is a system called Solvage, which helps people to understand how to sight sing music. So they basically put a different sound to every note within a scale. But what this can help us understand right now is that there are 8 notes, but note number 1 and note number 8 are the same. Listen, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, back to do. And that's because our do, do are the same note, but in different octaves. That's what that word means. So an octave is basically 8 notes above, or an octave below would be 8 notes below the note that you're seeing. So when I said earlier that tenor music is often written an octave above where you're singing it, it will look scarily high on a piece of music. But in actual fact, you're singing all of those notes 8 notes lower than it's written. Okay? It's one of those quirks of music, and it's mainly because it makes it tidier when we write it down. If we write the tenor part an octave above, we can keep it all on one clef. Whereas if we write it where you're singing it, it becomes difficult to keep it on the treble clef or on the bass clef because you constantly have to move from one to the other. And so just to keep it nice and tidy and nice and neat, and to keep it all on one line for you, we write the tenor part up the octave because it's then able to stay on that one clef. That's it. So let's look at this. Now, if you did some music in school, you may have been taught certain acronyms to help you remember what notes each line and each space represent. Now, the ones that I learned when I was at school is that the spaces on the treble clef spell out the word face. This is an F, this is an A, C, E, face. Now remember I said that there are 8 notes in each octave. Each of those notes in music get given a letter name. And we start from the beginning of the alphabet and we go up to G. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, back to A. We start again. So all of your notes will be named something between A and G. So like I said, F, A, C, E. So I immediately, if I see a note in one of those, written in one of the spaces, not on the line, but in a space, it helps me to immediately know, okay, that's the third one up, that's going to be a C. It's just one way of helping you to find it. In terms of the lines, the acronym I was taught, and I'm sure there will be several, and if you know a different one, fill us in, but the one I was taught was that every good boy deserves football. I don't know why they chose that. I've heard variations on that as well. Every good boy deserves French fries, whatever you want to use. But all that's telling you is that the first line is an E, the next line is a G, every good. Next line is a B, boy. Next line is a D, deserves. Next line is an F, football. So that's telling you the very basic, every good boy deserves football. So again, if you see a note written on the very bottom of the line, you know straight away that must be an E, because that's the acronym to help you with that. Now that being said, that's kind of useful, but what's a much more useful thing for you to understand is that these note names go in order of the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And once you get to G, you start all over again. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And once you get to G, you start all over again. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And it just keeps going like that. Now, in the treble clef, you can see that if we start just on those lines and spaces that I just talked about, so we start on E on this line, so E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So essentially, so long as you know even one space or one line and what note that is, you can work out any note from that one note that you know. So if the only thing you remember is that the first space is an F, no matter what note you see, you can climb up line, space, line, space, line, space until you get to the note that you're looking for, and you will understand then what note name that is. Okay? Now this becomes particularly useful for solo singers to understand, because if you are working on your voice and you're trying to figure out where the transitional areas of your voice are. So at what point do you start to leave your chest voice and move into a mix or into your head voice? If you understand what note that's happening at, when you pick up a piece of sheet music, you can look at it and immediately know straight away that's going to be a tricky note because it's right in my transitional area and I need to watch out for that. So when I'm teaching singers, that's the reason why I like them to have a little bit of understanding about sheet music, because I like them to be able to pick up the song that they're working on and immediately understand for themselves why certain parts of the song they're finding easy, certain parts of the song they're finding more difficult. And it's not always as simple as, oh, it gets difficult when it gets high, because in a lot of cases, once you get out of that transitional area into the next part of your voice, it becomes easy again. So knowing where where your voice is starting to transition and being able to translate that into sheet music becomes really valuable when you're developing your voice. Now, because this is limited and we only have 5 lines, what happens when we get to the very top is that if we need the note to go higher, we basically add an extra line in and draw our note on that extra line. And you can add in as many extra lines really as you need to up there. And similarly at the bottom, if you want a note that's lower than this E, which you probably will, you need to be able to go underneath it. So the space directly underneath it's going to be a D. And then if you want the next note down, which will be a C, you need to draw a line, and that's where your C goes. Now this C that sits underneath the stave on a treble clef is a particularly significant note when it comes to music, because that is what we refer to as middle C. You may have heard that terminology before. Middle C coins its name really from the fact that it is the C that is right in the middle of a piano. That's why it's middle C. But it also becomes the crossover point from your treble clef to your bass clef, because on both the treble clef and the bass clef, the middle C is written with an extra line. With the treble clef, that extra line is at the bottom. With the bass clef, that extra line goes up the top. So it's a useful note to be aware of, and it's also the note that people tend to use as the beginning of a scale, because in the key of C, you do stick just purely to the notes that are written within the stave. There are no variations. So if I was playing that on a piano, I would be using only the white notes and none of the black notes to do my do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. I have no idea whether I actually just sung that in C. If you've got a piano at home, you can check. Probably I didn't. But I don't have perfect pitch. But you get the idea, right? To have that simple scale like that without any accidentals involved, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, then that's why C becomes a very useful place to begin from. So this is your treble clef. So just to recap, treble clef with your middle C at the bottom there on its extra line. And so if you want to start from A, because the alphabet starts at A, we need to go 2 down from C, right? So below the first line would be B, and then so we'd need a second line drawn in to become our A. So here is all of the notes moving upwards on the treble clef: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, right? And that goes on and on. You can keep going higher and higher and higher. In terms of singing, You probably wouldn't go hugely over the top of the treble clef, because then it goes into proper kind of squeaky territory that we don't use very often in our voices. So like I say, yes, you can learn your little mnemonics, you can learn your every good boy deserves football, or the word face moving up in the spaces there, or you can just learn 2 or 3 notes that you like, whichever ones, and start to count upwards from them or downwards from. Upwards is easier because it's easier to say the alphabet in order rather than backwards. If you're coming back down through the stave, then you've got to go backwards in the alphabet. So if you know where that middle C is written, for example, or you know where the F is in the face, the first space on that treble clef, then you can be counting up from there. So that's how you know what note you're singing. What I don't kind of want you to do, however, is I don't want you to take every piece of music you have and write the letter names for all of the notes underneath everything. Because if you do that, you actually won't get any quicker at identifying what the notes are. If you just learn, like I say, 2 or 3 and you count up and down from there, what will begin to happen is that every time you go to count to figure out what note that is, the more you do that, the quicker you will just recognize that that space is a certain note name. So you just get better at understanding straight away as soon as you see it, oh, that's an F, oh, that's an E, oh, that's a G. Whereas if you constantly write them underneath, it stops your brain having to work that out, and so you actually get very lazy with it and you never figure it out for yourself, and you're constantly tied to having to write the note names underneath it. So the more you can have to do it every time, the better. So that's your treble clef, right? Now the bass clef. Let's have a look at this, because like I said, if you're singing a bass part, your part will be notated in the bass clef. And even if you're not, it's useful information, so you may as well learn it and understand it. Because if you ever do decide to learn the piano, for example, then the bass clef you need to know. Generally speaking, when you're playing a piano, you play the treble clef with your right hand and you play the bass clef with your left hand. So when you're watching someone play the piano and you see them reading all this music, they are taking in one line of music for their right hand and one line of music for their left hand and playing them at the same time. It's quite an undertaking, and it's not something that comes quickly or easily to many people. They have to practice both separately and then add them together and so on and so forth. But let's look at the bass clef, because like I say, if you're singing the bass part, your music will likely be written in the bass clef. So with the bass clef, remember the clef looks like this. So that tells you it's a bass clef. And when they are written together, the treble clef will always be on top and the bass clef will always be underneath it. It is also collectively sometimes known as the grand staff, when you get just one treble and one bass clef drawn together like that. So your bass clef here, the notes, the lines and the spaces, we're now kind of moving downwards from our middle C. So our middle C, which we saw written at the bottom on that extra line in the treble clef, in the bass clef, looks like this. So you can see that it is a line just above the stave that takes you to the middle C. And then you have to kind of move downwards. And here is where you kind of have to say your alphabet backwards, because one down from that middle C and you're finding yourself on B, one down from that and you're on A. Then from A, you can't go backwards from A, so you have to start all over again, go to G, then to F, E, D, C, B, A. But it works the same way. You're climbing up one note at a time. So again, if you're going to be reading the bass clef, if you can learn just 1 or 2 of these notes, maybe learn where the C is at the bottom. So learn that the second space from the bottom is a C. That's generally the one that I look for when I'm looking at the bass clef. Or you might learn where the A is at the bottom, and then you can count up from there when you are looking at the music. And again, this can be extended by drawing those extra lines for notes to sit on at the bottom, and also at the top, like that middle C. It's just extending slightly up above the bass clef stave. So have a little look. Here are your two clefs together, your bass clef and your treble clef, and you can just see that pattern of it just climbing up one letter at a time, getting to the G, then starting back at the A all over again. Okay, let's have a little fun. Let's play a game. So very quickly, before we play, have a little look at this screen, and I want you to memorize 1 or 2 notes from the treble clef and 1 or 2 notes from the bass clef. So have a little look, choose whichever ones you want. I want you to memorize that as your, ground zero that you're going to work out the other notes off the back of. So whether it's understanding where middle C is, or whether it's understanding where the F is on the treble clef, or where the A is at the bottom of the bass clef, I just want you to memorize 1 or 2 of those. And then what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to put up some notes, and I want to see whether you can figure out what note that is. Okay, so I am going to put 8 notes up on the screen. Some of them are in the treble clef, some of them are in the bass clef. What I want you to do here is I want you to pause the video, and I want you to see if you can work out the note names of each of these notes. Off you go. How did you do? Did you get them all? Let's go through and let's make sure you got them all right. So we've got in the treble clef, the first note is an A. The second note in the treble clef is an F, the one right at the very top. Next one along is an E, and the last one is a B. On the bass clef, the first one was a G, then we've got a D, a B, and another B. So you can see that there are actually 3 different B's written on this, on these 2 clefs, on these 2 staves, and they are in 3 different octaves, which means that the lowest one, the last note on the bass clef here, lowest one is 8 notes below the previous B, and that one is 8 notes below the one that is written on the treble clef. So there are 8 notes between those to get from one to the next, but they are all a B. And that is why I can ask a group of men and women singers to all sing the same note, and they will all be able to find that note somewhere that is comfortable to them. So for example, if I said, everybody sing ah, what you'll find is that the men immediately sing that note an octave lower, because to try and match me where I am would be incredibly high in a male voice. So it would seem really bizarre for them. They'd have to go right up at the top of their head voice to sing that note. Ah! So instead, your brain will interpret that pitch and go, okay, I'm going to sing that same note just an octave below. Ah, ah. So the same note can be sung in several octaves. Ah, 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 ah. They're all the same note. So they will all have the same note name, but they will be written in different places on the stave. Now, do you remember how I said earlier that tenor music, and by that I also mean lead vocal, male vocals, when they are notated, are more often than not notated in the treble clef. They are notated in the treble clef, but they are sung an octave lower. So it would be the equivalent of what I just did there. So it would be written as if it was going to be ah, but the men would actually be expected to sing ah. And like I say, it's just because it makes it easier to keep it all written on one clef. Whereas when you're looking at a bass part, if you've got a particularly low piece of music, it could potentially all be written on the bass clef without having to come up higher than that kind of middle C area. Most bass parts wouldn't sing much above a middle C. Most of their notes are below then. And so it makes more sense for them to be written on the bass clef. Whereas a tenor part often does go above the C and up to Fs and Gs. And if you try and write that on the bass clef, you have to add a lot of extra lines. So you might as well move into the treble clef, but then that makes it very messy, like I say, to kind of go, well, these notes are sung on the bass clef, and then when you get to this point, oh, now we need to change clefs. So instead, they just write everything on the treble clef until you sing it an octave below. So if you look at a piece of music and you go, wow, that looks ridiculously high, that looks like where the sopranos ought to be singing, you're right, it is written where the sopranos usually sing, but you're going to be singing everything down the octave, so it actually is in your range. Okay? So now you have a better understanding as to how to find out what note you're singing. The other thing that you need to be aware of are these accidental signs. So we use these symbols here whenever we need things to move up one note or down one note. And the most common ones that you'll come across are sharps and flats. So here's our sharp. And if you put this symbol in front of any of the notes, it sends that note one higher. So if you were on a piano, this is where you start to use the black notes, because it's not going up one full step like do, re. It's going up a half step to the next note upwards, which would be possibly a sharp or a flat. So sharps take it up one, flats, which look a little bit like a B, take it down one. So this whole thing becomes a lot easier as soon as I get my piano in front of me. So I have my piano here. So let's talk about these accidentals. So within our octave, yes, we have this series of 8 notes. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But actually there are notes hidden in between those. If I play every note in an octave, we get... It actually takes 13 notes to get back to where you started. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And then we're back to C again. And so in order to kind of show you when we want those in-betweeny notes, we use these sharps and these flats to indicate that. So if I just want a D, then we just have that D. But if I want the note below that, I would stick a flat in front of it to make it D flat, D, D flat, D, D flat, D. If I want it one note higher, I'm going to stick the sharp sign in front of it. D, D sharp, D, D sharp, D, D sharp, D, D flat, D, D sharp, D, D flat. Now sometimes as a bit of a shortcut, you will see that right at the beginning of the piece of music, right where it tells you the time signature, where you're looking for that 4/4, you might see there's a whole bunch of flats or a whole bunch of sharps written next to that 4/4. What that tells you is that every time you come across the note where the sharp is written, you can assume that that's going to be a sharp. And this becomes important because, like I said earlier, the key of C, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, has no sharps and no flats in it, but other keys do. So for example, if I play the key of F, do, re, mi, fa, fa in the key of F is a B flat. So we're going to need a flat every time we get to the note B. It needs to be flattened in order for it to stay in key. Do, re, mi, fa, because otherwise do, re, mi, fa. It's not quite right. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So we need to have that flat in there. And again, just to make things neater, rather than every time you write a B in the piece of music, rather than writing that flat in front of it every time, it tends to get written in the key signature at the beginning. And then you just know, if you were playing the piano, for example, you would just know that that's going to be a B flat that you play. Every time you see a B in that piece of music, you're actually going to be playing a B flat. So when you see a sharp or a flat actually written within the body of the piece of music, right in front of one of those notes, it's usually because that sharp or that flat note doesn't appear within the key that that song is written in. So it's a thrown in extra note that doesn't fit within that normal do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do of that piece of music. And so they just want one particular note to do that. Similarly, if you see this sign here, so if the music, for example, was written in the key of F, so that every time you hit a B, it's supposed to be a B flat. But if there's a particular phrase where actually they want you to sing an actual B and not a B flat, they will stick this symbol in front of it. That neutralizes it and gets rid of any previous flat or sharp that has been written in front of it. So if it is assumed it should be a B flat because the key signature at the beginning of the music said it was going to be a B flat, if you put this symbol in front of it, it just takes it back to being a good old traditional B. Now, I'm telling you all this not because I need you necessarily to understand, oh, that one's got to be a sharp when I sing. More so that when you see it in the piece of music, you just have a better understanding as to what that symbol means and it doesn't make you worry about what you've got to do. All that symbol is doing is telling you that it is a flat or a sharp version of the note that's written. But in terms of you as a singer, like I say, unless you are trying to learn to sight sing, which is a very specific skill that is only useful in very specific places, shall I say. If you are just using the music as a guideline for you as a solo singer, or so that you can talk to other musicians, perhaps you're fronting a band and they all talk in music speak, it's good for you to understand what it all means and what it's all for. So if they start having a conversation, if your band starts having a conversation about, oh, we need, is that in D flat or is that, so you just start to understand a little bit more about what they're talking about, and it just makes you feel a little bit more confident that you are a musician just as much as anybody else. So I don't want you to get too caught up or too worried about seeing sharps, flats and neutrals, because it's going to mean very little to you in the bigger scheme of things. But I do want you to recognize those symbols, because when you see a symbol on the page that you don't know, it can be disconcerting because you don't know whether it's relevant to you or not. So if you understand what all the symbols generally mean, then you start to understand what you can kind of disregard and what is actually a very important thing for you to know. So for example, I think it's incredibly useful to know the note lengths, because it helps you to understand whether you're singing a longer note on that word or whether it's a short one. I find that is a very useful thing to know. I think it's also incredibly useful for you to be able to work out what note you're singing on in terms of where that sits within the difficult areas of your voice. So just knowing how to work it out not necessarily being able to look at it and tell me exactly what it is, but being able to look at it and go, hang on, I'll figure it out. Right, that's an E. Being able to do that is also incredibly useful for you as a singer. The other thing that I find is incredibly useful is understanding dynamics, which is what we're going to cover in the next lesson. But like I say, having a wider general understanding as to what all of these things in the music mean are going to be just good for you to be able to look at the music and go, there's a flat there, but that doesn't really mean much to me because I've heard the melody anyway, so I know what I'm aiming for in terms of the tune. I hope that makes sense to you. Now, what happens if you see something that looks like this? And you will see things that look like this, particularly if you're involved in any kind of group singing. So whether that be in a choir or whether that be providing backing vocals in a group, you may well come across in your sheet music more than one note written on top of each other. When you see this, this is an indication that there is some harmony involved. Harmony is basically more than one note being sung at the same time. And there's only one of me, so I can't demonstrate it with my voice, but I do have the piano, so I can demonstrate it with the piano. So, if one person is singing, ah, and the next person is singing, ah. So here we've got middle C, this is on the treble clef, right? Middle C and an E. And they're written one on top of each other. So not next to each other, but directly on top of each other. That tells us that both those notes are being sung at the same time, like this. So it's not ah and then ah, it's both at the same time. Now, oftentimes harmony will be written like this. So there'll be more than one note written at the same time. And if you are, for example, singing in a choir or something and you know that you are singing the soprano part, for example, you will nearly always be singing the note on top of this. We would call this a chord. Chord is just another way of saying notes in harmony with each other, okay? So a chord is just building notes up on top of each other. So here we see that the first note, the higher note, for the sopranos would be an E. And that means that the alto part, the lower part, is doing the C. It's useful for you to be able to decipher that so that you don't accidentally follow the wrong note. Because if you're looking at the notes, it can be confusing when there's more than one note on there. But very simply, if you are singing the higher part of whatever you've got, so whether that's a tenor over a bass written on the same clef, or a soprano, you might also have soprano, second soprano and alto all written on the same stave, in which case there will be 3 notes written together. Right? All sung at the same time. So long as you know which part you're supposed to be singing, you can just make sure that you are following along either the top line, the middle notes, or the bottom notes, whichever one you've got to find. What is helpful is understanding intervals between the notes. So when you're following a piece of music, being able to understand really the difference between a small jump up and a big jump up can be enough to guide you to the right note. So let's look at some harmonies and some intervals, and let's just decipher them a little bit. Okay, so this example that we've just been looking at, one singer is singing the C and the next singer is singing the E. And I've just put all of these on nice long semi-breves. We're just doing one big 4-beat note on every one for today. This interval is known as a third third because we presume C is your first note. 1, 2, 3. E becomes the third note. So that interval is a third that you're singing there. This next one here, I'm keeping the lower singer on the C. The higher singer is now going to sing an F. So that's what this harmony sounds like. And if the last one was a third, you may have already guessed that we would refer to this as a fourth, because we're going to play the first note in the scale and we're going to play the fourth note. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we would refer to that as a fourth. But it's just that interval between the notes, between the first note and the fourth note. That's the jump there. So let's look at another one. So again, I'm going to keep my lower singer on the C, but this time the higher singer is going to be singing this A. So now we need to kind of work out where the A is to know what we might call this interval. So C is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is called a sixth. Very simple. Okay? So it's just a different harmony, a different interval between the notes. And then this last one here, we've got the lower singer still singing their C. We're keeping that as our root note. And now I've got the higher singer singing on the C above. Now when that happens, we immediately just call that the octave. So you can hear that that's the same note. It's both the C. Being sung together. And so when you hear people talking about intervals, but you know, in harmonies and whatnot, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about, well, what's the difference between the note the first person is singing and the note the second person is singing? How far apart are those notes? How close together are they? And when you are singing in harmony, whether that's providing backing vocals for a lead vocalist, or whether that's singing in like a choral or group sort of situation, if you can see those harmonies written down, again, it can help you to gauge, okay, am I very close to the other part, or am I very far away from the other part? If you know that the first part is singing ah, if you can look at that on the page and see, oh, there's quite a big gap between what they're singing and what I'm singing, it can help you fish for the right note, even if you don't know what that note actually is, what the note name is. If you've not figured out what note name that is, you can see the difference between the two notes, and that can be helpful in of itself. Now, as well as understanding how your note fits into a harmony with other notes, what is also useful is to start to understand the intervals between the first note you sing and the second note you sing, and so on and so forth. Because if you can see on the piece of music that there is a big jump from one note to the next, again, that can be enough information there for you to know generally where that note is going to go. And if you can see that there's only the tiniest little step, maybe it's moved from a space into the line above, then you know that you're only going up a little bit at a time. And bearing in mind that general do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, having that little pattern in your head can also help you to figure out how far up you need to be going from that note. So if you can see that the first note is the C, and then the next note you've got to sing is a D, in your head you can be going do, re, okay, that's the next note I'm gonna sing. That's kind of how solfege works. Gets you really good at understanding the intervals between do and re and do, mi. And if you get really good at recognizing the different sounds between the intervals between each one, then you can begin to sight sing really well, really efficiently, but it does take time. That's something that you just get better at the more you do it, essentially, and the more you practice singing those intervals and understanding the differences between them. But like I say, just knowing that there's a little step or a big step could be enough information to really help you use the sheet music to your advantage. So let's have a little play. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put some music up on the screen for you, and I have divided it into soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. And I have written each part on its own stave. Now make sure you check whether that's written in the treble clef or in the bass clef before you begin. What I want you to do again is I want you to try and work out what notes, first of all, are in that pattern. Choose one. You don't have to do all four of them. Choose one of the parts, or if you want to, go through all four. Why not? If you've got the time, go through all four. But choose at least one. I want you to figure out what the notes are, so you can write them, down, which notes it's going from and to. But I also want you to figure out what is the gap between the notes. Does it go up 1? Does it go up 4? Does it go up 8? How much of a space is there between the notes, and is the spaces going upwards or are they going downwards? So just remember counting that in your alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. So every time you're moving from a line to a space, that's one step. So I want you to count how many steps up or how many steps down there are between each of the 4 notes that I give you for each part. And like I say, if you want to do it for all 4, go for your life. The more you practice doing it, the easier it is to recognize. Okay, off you go. So how do we get on? Let's go through these together. So our sopranos, they are starting on the C, above middle C. So it's here. They sing this for 4 notes. The next note goes up to a D, which is 1 step up. Okay, it's 1 step above the C. So we started there. We step up to It's just 1 step above it. Then the 3rd note goes back to the C. Now that's useful information because we've already sung the C. So we already know what that sounds like. We started, we went up to Re, now we have to come back to So immediately we're kind of almost sight singing when we do that. So we've started on C, we've gone up a step, we've come back down a step, and now the last note in that sequence is an A, which goes down 2 steps. So we've just ended here. We have to go down 1, 2 to there. So that whole sequence for the sopranos would go. So you can see that you can kind of hear whether it's they're all very small steps there, but you can hear that that last one was a bigger drop down than any of the previous steps. Okay, let's look at the alto line. So the altos are starting on the G. The next note for them is an F, which goes down 1 step. We're going 1 note down. The following note for them is an A, which from that F is 2 steps up. There we go. So we've gone from A to A, because we've gone up 2 steps. And then their final note in their little sequence is another F, which again, we've already sung that one. So we should kind of have a little remnants of where that note was to go back to it. So from there we go back to ah. So that sequence for the altos, they've got ah. Yes? Good. All right, let's look at the tenors. Now, which clef is the tenor one written in? It's written in the treble clef. Did you notice that this treble clef has, shall we say, a little extra something to it? Did you notice that? Now, this isn't always there. Technically, it should always be there, but over the years, people have just come to assume it. But you can see in this treble clef, there is a tiny little number 8 written underneath the treble clef. And that is your little indicator that you are going to sing everything 8 notes or an octave below what is written. And like I say, really all tenor music should have that little symbol there so that it kind of tells you that information. But a lot of the times these days it gets kind of dropped because we have done it for long enough now that we just presume if it's a male piece of music and it's written in the treble clef, we just presume that you're singing it down the octave. It would be incredibly rare to have male music written in the treble clef and actually sung on the note that it's written on. It's pretty much always sung an octave below. But that's what that tiny little 8 there is telling you. So although it is written here on this D, the tenors would actually be singing it here. Now, because I am not a man, this can get a little confusing for you. Because when I sing it where it's actually written, 99% of the time, the men will automatically hear it in their own voices and place it in their own voices down the octave. So if I'm demonstrating something to a male singer, I will always demonstrate it up the octave so that they can find it. Because if I sing it on the actual note they're singing, what tends to happen is that they try and find it down here. And it's not written all the way down there. Otherwise it would be in the bass clef. It's written as this note. So I'm going to sing it on the note that it's actually supposed to be sung on. But just be aware, if you're a man watching this at home, you're going to need to be thinking an octave above in order to get it in the right place in your voice. But let's go through the intervals for the tenor. So the first note is here, on this D. The second note in that pattern, well, guess what? It's exactly the same note, which means you don't move anywhere. There is no interval. There is no stepping. You're not stepping up. You're not stepping down. You're staying exactly where you are. For the next note. The third note in this sequence goes to an F. And that F is 2 steps higher than the D we were just singing on. So we just did we have to go up 1, 2, to find the next note. Like I say, this is how people start to sight sing. It's just knowing immediately what that interval sounds like and being able to go straight to it. Right now I'm kind of filling in the gaps for you. So this, we gotta go up 1 and then 2, and that's the note we want. And that's just as legitimate a way for you to figure it out. So if you're sat there, for example, in a choir and you're like, where does that next note go to? You can kind of go 1, 2, 3, oh, there it is, to figure that out. So you've gone from here, so that tenor part, the third note, we're on that F, and then the last note on that tenor part drops down to a C. Because remember, this is written in the treble clef. So it's really this C that's written, but that treble clef with the 8 underneath it told us that you actually have to be singing this one. Okay? And this now has jumped down 3 steps. So we've just been on the F, we go down 1, 2, 3 to find the C. So that whole section for the tenors, they've got ah, ah. Now, if nothing else, just knowing that you're moving up or that you're moving down to the next note can oftentimes be useful enough for you to know. It just helps you find your way. Okay, so bass part. Now the bass part, which clef is this written in? Yes, the bass clef. So we have to be very careful about which note we think it is, because we cannot use those every good boy deserves football type mnemonics to help you with this, because it's different. I mean, you can make up your own mnemonic for it if it helps. You go ahead, figure out what the lines and what the spaces are, and come up with your own little saying to help you remember it, if that helps you. But our bass part, we are starting on an E, and it's this E, which is a little low in a female voice. I can just about make it, because I have a relatively deep voice. But for most female voices, that would be a little too low for them to be singing. So again, oftentimes when I'm demonstrating to a man, I would do it up the octave. So I would play it there, but I would sing it because it's the same note, but an octave above, 8 notes higher. This one, it's another E. But we're starting on that E. The next note in that phrase goes to a G, which is 2 steps higher. So we're going to have to do 2 steps up. 1, 2, there. So there's our next note, ah. Okay. The third note in that sequence jumps right up to middle C. There. So the interval between those 2 notes, we've just been on that G. We have to go from G, A, B, C, 3 steps higher. So that's where you're going to go up to. And then the final note on that bass is an A. And we go down. From that we have to go down 2 steps. 1, 2 to get to that note. So that whole part for the bass, and I'm going to try and sing it in the bass part. So it goes So like I say, whether or not you know exactly what note you're singing on the whole time is of less importance to me. If you are able to recognize whether you should be jumping up a long way or you should be jumping down a long way, or whether you should just be stepping 1 step up or 1 step down, becomes a far more useful tool. And if you want to get particularly good at that, a good thing for you to do to practice is to practice doing those intervals. So what is it like to go just 1 step? Here's do to re, do, re, do, re, do, re. What's it like to go up to the next note? Do, mi, do, mi, do, mi. Now if you really want to get full on into sight singing, you need to memorize all of these. And actually there are lots of little tricks and tools you can use to memorize those intervals better and better. So the interval between your root note and your third, and your root note and the 4th note, and so on and so forth. You can find little famous parts of famous lines that sound like that to help you memorize. So for example, an octave jump is somewhere over the rainbow. That's a nice easy one to memorize your octave jump. Happy birthday gives you one step up from your do, re, do. Happy birthday. So if you really want to get into that really in depth, you can absolutely start listening to those intervals and see if you can spot for yourself a tune that you recognize. There's a whole list of them. In fact, I will put here now a little list that you can go through and find those intervals. If you want to spend more time on that, absolutely go ahead and do so. Every one of these there'll be somewhere in music, somewhere there will be a song that will help you understand or recognize that interval. So that's it for today. Homework this week. Take that piece of music that you've been looking at over the past few lessons, and I want you now to go back through and I want you to pay close attention to what note names there are, whether you're on a C, whether you're on a G, whether you're on an F. I want you just to start to be aware of the intervals. Are the jumps between the notes big jumps? Are they small jumps? Also, take a close look at whether the vocal line in your music is written in the treble clef or the bass clef. And also just have a little look around to see if you can spot any of those accidentals, those sharps, those flats, those neutrals. They might be right at the very beginning of the piece of music to show you the key signature, what key the piece of music is written in, or they might just crop up throughout the music. But have a little look for them so that you begin to identify all of these symbols, and hopefully by now you're starting to understand more of what's on the page than you don't understand. And if you're at that point, then you're doing well. Next lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about dynamics, about everything that's written on the page to help you understand whether you should be singing loudly or softly, and also anything else that might help you understand how the music should be expressed, whether it should be sung, kind of forcefully, for example, or whether it should be sung very short and sharp. There are lots of musical symbols that help you to identify that. So that's the next group of symbols that we need to get familiar with. So get going, have a look at your music, see what more you now can identify from that piece of music, and we will start to decipher even more next lesson. Well done.